in labor force. So that's what I mean by we don't care about you. Of course, we care about you. We care about everybody, but we are just not counting you for or against the unemployment rate. So this is kind of the key to understanding right here. Everyone falls in one of these two categories. And what we're going to do after we go through this, I'm going to have you make the determination if you are either in the first category, not in the labor force, or if you're in the labor force and employed, or if you're in the labor force and unemployed. So you're going to have to determine that for yourself.
So essentially, not in the labor force would mean unable to work?
Not necessarily. That's one of the reasons you would be in there.
Okay.
There's a number of reasons. So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's define who's in the labor force. So we're going to break everybody up into two categories here. The first group here is, so here, we'll start with this. We're going to start with everyone. So this is all 330 million people. We're going to break everyone up into two groups. I think this visual kind of helps a little bit more to see. So everyone is either not in the labor force or in the labor force. And we're going to start with not in the labor force. So we're going to put that over here. And over here, we'll have in the labor force. So we're going to split every single person in the country up one of two groups, not in the labor force or in the labor force. And if we recall, if you're not in the labor force, now when I said that we don't care about you, that was kind of a little bit tongue in cheek. That's not exactly what we mean. If you're not in the labor force, we're not even counting whether you are for or helping or hurting the unemployment rate. We don't even count you at all. So if you're not in the labor force, let's go over all the people who are classified as being not in the labor force.
I have a simple one. Children.
Yep. Yes, and that is the first one. If you are 15 years old or younger, you are not in the labor force. Now, you can have a job at 15. You can even have a job at 14, 13, you babysit, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't matter. You're not in the labor force, so we're not counting whether you are employed or unemployed. So everybody who's 15 years old and younger is classified as being not in the labor force. So what you want to understand as we go through this, don't confuse working and not working with being in the labor force and not being in the labor force. Because you can not be in the labor force and still have a job. So we have two different things going on. You can be working or not working. You can be in the labor force or not be in the labor force. The two are two very different things. All right, our next group.
Student?
We will get to that one, yep. Retired. Now, this is a slightly different meaning than what we would normally use as retired. Normally, we talk about retired. We think of somebody who is 65 years old and they have white hair and they're going to move down to Boca Raton, Florida and play golf for the remainder of their life. Now, that is true. That is one person retired. But another way to look at this with retired is anyone who is not seeking work. So this could be the 65-year-old who has moved from Chicago down to Boca Raton, Florida, and is going to play golf the rest of their life. It can be a 35-year-old who hit the lottery and no longer has to work anymore. It can be a 20-year-old who is just completely unmotivated and refuses to look for a job and chooses to live in their parents' basement. Those are all defined as being retired.
It could also mean a stay-at-home mom.
Yes, but that's actually a different, and that's what you're saying is true, and that's going to be a different category. And wait until you hear the terminology they use instead of stay-at-home mom.
I'm confused, but it's okay, I guess. We'll get there.
Once we get through all these categories, it'll help. It'll make a lot more sense. Next one was just mentioned, full-time students. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses the Department of Education definitions full-time student, which would be the equivalent of 12 credits or more per semester. So if you're a full-time student, you are not in the labor force. Even though, and I'm assuming many of you are probably full-time students, you're probably also working. I know the numbers that we see are about 80% of you are currently working and you're a full-time student. But if you're a full-time student, you're not in the labor force. You're not counting for or against the unemployment rate. We're not counting you at all. All right. So Hannah threw out a term that is, I think we stopped using in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is stay-at-home mom, because is it only a mom that can stay home and take care of a family? No, but that's okay.
I said it could be a mom or a dad, so.
Okay. So stay-at-home parent is what you said. Is what you meant. Okay, so stay-at-home parent. However, the Bureau of Labor Statistics likes to go back and use really bad terms from the 50s and then not change them. So the term they use, and I'm not even going to write it down because if my mom saw me using this term, she would flip out.
Is it homemaker?
It is homemaker. So the federal government isn't great at updating terminology. If you remember when we talked about Social Security and Medicare is still referred to as hospital insurance, even though we haven't used the term hospital insurance since the 1960s. So they still use the term homemaker. We're not going to use the term homemaker. We're going to use the most recent, which I think is a way more descriptive than homemaker, because as my mom used to say, I stayed home and take care of the kids, but I didn't make this house. And then she worked anyway. But we're going to say the term that the Census Bureau uses, head of household. Head of household. You can use whichever term you want, but I'm going to throw up there head of household because even though it would be accurate for me to write homemaker, my mom found out 46 years old now would still get in trouble. So we're going to use
don't some people view the head of household as the guy who goes out or girl who goes out and like gets the money?
Yeah.
Usually the term head of household is somebody that their full-time job is taking care of the house.
Okay.
So children, whatever else you would do with the house.
Okay.
Basically a homemaker.
Oh no, I have a question.
Yeah.
Does military fall in the not in the labor force because it's not civilian?
Correct. I'm going to get to that one as well. So full-time military is considered not in the labor force, even though by definition, 100% of them are working, because by definition, if you're full-time military, that's your career. So we'll get to that. Head of house. So you guys know this stuff already. I'm just telling you what you already know. All right, well, let's throw it up there. We'll keep that up there as part of this list here, military.
Probably government jobs.
And that's full-time military.
Meaning like non-National Guard?
Correct, yeah, not including reserves, National Guard, things like that. If you're full-time military, and that's where the term civilian from civilian labor force comes. We are not counting those employed by the military. Then we get into my favorite, which is institutionalized.
What?
That's the people who are sick, either permanently or temporarily.
Correct. And there's one other group under there.
Prison population.
Correct. If you are incarcerated, you're classified as being institutionalized. I mean, really, if you're a full-time student, you're also kind of institutionalized, right? Don't write that. Don't put that in your notes. It's going to come back.
Adam said it. I heard it. Adam said it. I heard
Adam
it.
told me to tell you. There's a lot of things I like to cover in class. I just have to remind people not to write it down. All right. I'm going to see your email signature line is going to be like, full-time students are institutionalized, Adam Gifford, instead of a motivational saying. Okay. So there is everybody who's not in the labor force. 15 years or younger, you're retired, full-time student, head of household, full-time military, or institutionalized. Now, again,
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. It's most people. So let's see, let me do quick math. 332, 170 million. It's a little more than half the population. We don't count. So that's who's not in the labor force. So even again, if you have a job, don't have a job, doesn't matter. You're not counted for or against the unemployment rate. So here's what I want you to do. Figure out for yourself, and you don't have to, if this is personal information, you don't need to talk about it. But does anybody want to volunteer to determine if they are in the labor force or not in the labor force? Okay.
Can
you
you
in
be
the labor
both?
force or not in the labor force? Cannot be both.
School is automatically disqualified.
So if you're a full-time student, you're not in the labor force.
All right, then I am not in the labor.
Okay. Anybody else want to volunteer there?
I'm also not in the labor force because I'm
Okay.
a full-time student.
Full-time student? Okay. So here's a question. Is anybody here in the labor force? Besides me, I'm in the labor force.
So
So I'm carrying the whole team here. What was that?
You said less than 12 credit hours is not full-time student?
Correct.
Oh, it's semester we're both not in the labor force. Then. Yeah, you're carrying the team, Adam. Thanks.
All right. Well, you know, gotta do everything. So there's one more. There's one more, and I think Kelly had to mention this in the very, very beginning. Physically or mentally unable to work. I know we don't use the term disabled that much anymore, but physically or mentally unable to work. So there we go. And usually when I do this, and I'll do this in every single class, in most cases, I am the only one who's in the labor force. Occasionally I'll have maybe one, possibly two students who don't fall into any of these categories and they're also in the labor force. Very rarely I have any students in my class who are classified as being in the labor force. So that leaves everybody else. Everybody else is in the labor force. Any questions before we move on to the other half of this, who's in the labor force? Any questions on these groupings?
Why are they choosing to quantify our unemployment and not including all of these different people? Like, it's just confusing. Like, if someone doesn't want to work, they are not a part of the unemployment rate.
Correct. So this is really your key right here. We don't count people who are not seeking work. And the reason being is what we're trying to keep track of is how many people out there want to work and are not. Because then we can start, and the reason we collect this is, okay, now we can create policies, we can do things to help those people who currently want to work and aren't working. Because why would we create policy to help somebody who's retired, not looking for a job? So yeah, they're not working, but they're also not working by choice. So, you know, no matter what is happening, no matter what wages are, no matter what anything is, they're not going to work. They're done working. So that's kind of the overall idea behind this is we want to know the data about the people who are not working and want to be working.
I have an awkward question.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to word it. Is there a
We're
is
all
there a space?
here. Don't worry about how you word it. Just word it.
All right. Okay. Well, where do people who are living off of welfare and may or may not be pretending they want work fit?
So that's an interesting one. So if they are not seeking work, they are classified as being retired. So remember, the term retired is different than we would normally use it.
I think what he's
Whether
going
you
for
are-
is how some people, when they collect unemployment, they have to like actually apply for jobs to be able to get those benefits, even if they don't really want to work. So like, where
Yeah.
do those people fit?
Technically, they would be unemployed. So the idea behind that of you applying, and most states will require something like that. I know we eliminated that during the pandemic because it was like, well, good luck. But Arizona has that requirement as well. I know when I lived in Florida, they had that requirement. Pennsylvania has that requirement. Most states have that requirement. And the idea is if you are applying for jobs, technically you're looking for work, which means technically you're in the labor force and unemployed. Now, I saw it. So we owned, my wife and I, when we owned our businesses, we had an outdoor gear store. We sold backpacking, climbing, hiking equipment, and a running store. We sold running shoes, apparel, things like that. And we would have people that would come in and, just say, I want to fill out an application. And clearly they were just doing this because these were not people who were into running or outdoor activities, things like that. And it was kind of like, you're just doing this because you're required to, aren't you? So yeah, and that happens. My wife, she got laid off when we were in Florida. She was laid off for a month. And it was funny because she had to apply for, I think in that month, she had to show that she applied for 2 jobs. She just had to go online and say, which jobs did you apply for, and fill it out. It's not like anybody even checks up on that stuff. But that's usually the reason is if you're applying for a job, technically you are looking for work. Now, if you're half-ass applying for jobs, you're still technically applying for jobs, even though you're not really looking to work. And it's okay to ask questions like that. You don't have to. You don't have to dance around trying to say it the right way either. Just get it out there. Cool. That's a good question too. Excellent question. All right. So if you're in the labor force, we're going to break you down into 2 categories. You are either working or you are not working. So here's your definition of working. Because remember here, this is statistical analysis. We're doing a lot of data and statistical analysis, so we have to have specific definitions. So working means that you have worked at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks. If you worked at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks, congratulations, you're in the labor force and you are employed. So if you notice here, we talk about just about the unemployment rate. We're not talking about things like wages. We're not talking about gainful employment. It's simply, have you worked at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks? If the answer is yes, you are classified as being employed. And if you're not employed, you are not working. So this is where our unemployment rate comes from. Questions on these before we crank out the quick math to calculate unemployment rate.
What about self-employed people?
You are employed. You're working at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, so this doesn't look at self-employed versus being an employee, doesn't look at independent contractor versus employee. And in this, honestly, this doesn't, they don't even care if you're working in a legal industry or if you're working under the table versus paying taxes.
Why?
Yeah, the simple question is, have you worked at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks? So it's not, have you worked 1 hour as an employee, not as a business owner? Have you at least worked 1 hour in a legal industry? That's not what they're asking. The specific question is, have you worked for pay at least 1 hour in the past 2 weeks? If the answer is yes, you're employed.
If you had someone who works on and off every few months, after 3 weeks of not working, they would be unemployed?
Yeah, so what they do with these numbers, these are called seasonally adjusted numbers. So you do have a lot of jobs that are seasonal. So let's say you work at Snowbowl all winter. You work on you're lifty, you work in the lifts at Snowbowl. You work there all winter and you decide to take the whole summer off. Well, if I contact you to try to collect data and I ask you this question in February, you're going to be employed. If I come back and ask you this question in July, you're going to be unemployed. So what they do is they do seasonally adjusted. So they'll go back and adjust this to say, okay, did you work throughout the year in a seasonal job where you won't necessarily be looking for work in the off season? So technically, I only work 9 months a year. So my contract is August through May. And that's why I do this for a living. So
and
technically, I'm unemployed during the summer, but I'm not looking for work. So technically, I could be unemployed, but the fact is I have work. I just don't work during the year part-time. So they will go back. And that's when you look at this, and I'll show you the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. They always refer to it as seasonally adjusted numbers.
And
Yeah.
what about something that isn't as regular like that? Like my uncle
Well,
went to Hollywood, and it depends on if there's a movie and he gets a job. So
and that's going to fall under this seasonally seasonal adjusted numbers. Now, if he doesn't have a job for an entire year, he would be classified as being unemployed that year.
okay, would that be like
Yeah.
a calendar year or?
They do it as calendar year, January, or actually it's the federal government, so it's, what is it, November 1st through October 31st.
Okay.
But yeah, a full year.
I think that was all.
And then you can look at, and I'll show you on this, there's all kinds of data that you can get answers to all these questions. It's just not the specific unemployment rate. So you can find unemployment rate in Arizona. You can find the unemployment rate in Yavapai County. You can find the unemployment rate in the month of December for people who are not seasonally adjusted. So yeah, the data they collect there's a tremendous amount of data that you can just bury yourself in. So here's how the numbers work. Unemployment rate, if we go back to the beginning, is the percentage of the civilian labor force who is not working. So we're going to do a basic math percentage problem to see how the unemployment rate is calculated. I'm going to keep the numbers easy because I want you to understand the process, not get bogged down in math. So let's say we have 100 people in the labor force. We know it's bigger. We know right now it's about 165 million, but it's much easier to find fractions or percentages of 100 than it is of 165 million. Process is the same. You have 93 people working, 7 people not working. Based on that information, what is the unemployment rate?
Shem.
7%. 7 out of 100 is 7%. So 7 people are unemployed out of the civilian labor force. Therefore, 7% is your unemployment rate. pretty easy, but let's do one more just to make sure you understand it. So this is, oh boy, can't use this eraser that well. Same thing, we'll do 100. 89 are working, 11 are not working. What's your unemployment rate?
11%.
11%, perfect. You'll see a question like that on the quiz, just want to make sure you understand it. So relatively easy math, like I said, and I'm going to use base 100 anyway, or base 1,000 for the quiz. So that is how we calculate the unemployment rate. So really what it kind of looks like, if we use real numbers here, we have here, hold on. Let's erase this here. And you don't need to know realistic numbers because obviously this changes all the time. So our total population is about 330 million people. Labor force is currently 165 million, which means, oh boy, I don't have a calculator. Who's got a calculator? How many people are not in the labor force? So it's exactly the same, right? 165 million, 220, yeah. So it's almost evenly split. People not in the labor force, people in the labor force. Yeah, 200, that's 220, 320, 330, yeah. So that's what we're looking at. So let's calculate now how many people are unemployed. So our current unemployment rate is 165 million. I'm sorry, our current labor force is 165 million. Our current unemployment rate, and we'll take a look at this in a second, 6.3%. Let me pull up my calculator here. I'm going to throw this on because I haven't done this calculation yet. See if you can figure out how many people are currently unemployed.
I'm gonna guess 10.7 million. Or yeah.
Close.
$10,395,000.
Yep. So currently, and the numbers are slightly off. It's 165 and change, and this is 331, I think, but I'm just kind of rounding. So this gives you an idea right now of approximately how many people are unemployed. A little over 10 million people.
When we consider past unemployment rates, has the way we have calculated who is or isn't in the labor force and who isn't working, have we changed the way we calculate it?
Hasn't changed since 1919.
Okay.
And that's important because if you use the same, so in statistics, if you use the same process year after year, you can look at the change. The change in that process is accurate. The number itself might not be really, really accurate, but if you use the same process year after year, the change is accurate. So, and what's really important, this number, although this number is pretty important, 6.3%, what's really important is that number higher or lower than last year? Is that number higher or lower than the year before? And that's where the accuracy comes in. If you calculate it the same way every year, you'll now know what's the change year over year. And that's really where the importance is. You know, in other words, are we getting better or are we getting worse? We always want to shoot, obviously, for a lower unemployment rate.